You're coming on time. The song is
Morning, bro.
long. Who? What?
Recording on progress.
Recording in progress, indeed. So today we're talking about famous Amos. Do you know famous Amos?
No.
Well,
sir.
Oh,
after
no,
today,
sir.
you will know the famous Amos. Here we go. In 752 BC, there was a guy who was a shepherd. Amos was a prophet from Tekoa, a small village 10 miles south of Jerusalem. He took care of sheep and fig trees for a living. His name, Amos, means burden bearer, and he began prophesying around the year 752, 2 years before Jerusalem was hit by a powerful earthquake that terrified its citizens. Uzziah, now if you remember, there were two kingdoms, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. Uzziah was the king of Judah, and Jeroboam II was the king over Israel. So two different kings. Amos prophesied about the same time as the prophets Hosea, Jonah, and Isaiah. So at the same time Jonah was around, and Hosea and Isaiah, Amos was around that time too. The nation of Israel was enjoying a great time of prosperity and peace. This may have been because Assyria, or what's it? Where was Jonah sent? What's the city? The city Nineveh. Yes, thank you, Nineveh. It was because Assyria or Nineveh repented when Jonah preached and were no longer a threat, and that's why probably everything was peaceful and Israel was prosperous at that time. And so Amos had to prophesy to them. God provides Amos a sense of coming judgment to Israel's enemies, which got their attention. So he starts talking to people and he starts telling about the enemies first. Damascus or Syria has sinned against again and again. I will snap the bars that lock their gates. And people, ooh, great. God is going to do something about our enemies. Keep it up, Amos. Come on, come on. The Philistines, another nation, sold my people in Edom. I will set fire to their walls. God will judge our enemies. Yeah, keep it up, Amos. Come on, preach it. Tyre sold whole communities of captives, and Edom pursued Israel with a sword. Therefore, their fortresses will be consumed. Come on, Amos. You're on fire. Prophesy against our enemies. Ammon ripped open pregnant women, so God will consume her. Yes, they were very cruel at that time. Moab will go down in war cries, and I will destroy all her officials. Yes, come on, Amos, they say. Then the prophet put the people of Judah in his crosshair. Now he's talking to people of Israel, and Judah is in the south, Israel is in the north, and they're kind of enemies. So he talks about Judah this time, and Judah rejects the law of God, so I will burn down all of their palaces and forts. This prophecy was fulfilled in 605 to 586 BC when Nebuchadnezzar burned Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Babylon. Amos started with Judah only to move closer to his intended target, Israel. Now, some of it is not pretty. So, you, Israel, he says, you will not escape judgment. You trample the poor, and both father and son use the same slave girl. You sin twice. You take away the garments of widows and pledge, though the law commands you not to. Then you use them in your idolatrous worship. I destroyed the Amorites who occupied this land before you, and I gave you prophets. But you make them drink wine and tell them not to prophesy. Neither great strength nor military weapons will prevent God's judgment when he uses the Assyrians to execute his judgment. He started with the enemies that lived around Israel at that time, and he got closer and closer and closer to the target, which was Israel themselves. And the lesson for today is about how Israel was stealing from the poor. They were rich at that time. They were kind of prosperous, but they were stealing from the poor, and that's what he's talking about in one of the messages that he delivered. And I'll ask Gayana to read today, stealing from the poor, please.
Stealing from the poor. The kingdom of Israel had a split. There was a northern kingdom, still called Israel, and a southern kingdom, now called Judah. God spoke through different prophets who preached to the people in Israel and in Judah. Amos was a prophet who preached to the people in the northern kingdom, where some had become very rich while others lived in poverty. God told Amos to say this to the rich: "You sell honest men as slaves and poor men for a pair of sandals. You trample down the weak and helpless and push the poor aside. Of all the nations on earth, you are the ones I have cared for. This is why your sin is so terrible, and for that I will punish you."
That's right. So he says you're stealing from the poor. Some people are rich, but some are very poor. It's kind of like Sri Lanka right now, isn't it? Abhishek, will you read the second part? What should I do when someone can't pay me back? You lend money to somebody and they can't pay back. What shall I do then? Abhishek, would you read?
Yeah.
All right.
Jesus told a story about a servant who owed his master a lot of money. When he couldn't pay it back, the king ordered him to serve as a slave to pay his debt. The servant begged the king to be patient with him. The king felt sorry for the servant and forgave him his debt. But later on, when his same servant met someone else who owed him money, he was not willing to forgive the other person his small debt. God was angry because the rich Israelites demanded their money back from the poor, even though they themselves had no more than enough to live on. What made God even more angry was they sold others into slavery, forgetting that they themselves had been rescued from slavery in Egypt. If someone owes you something that they cannot give back, remember that things you should never become more important than people. If you are kind to others, God will be kind to you.
Yes, remember that things should never become more important than people. That's a very important thing for us to understand. If somebody cannot give you back what they took from you, forgive them. Be kind to each other. Like Israelites, they were so into money and wealth, they sold each other into slavery. They made slaves out of their own brothers and sisters. Israelites, yes. That's unheard of. And God hates slavery, and he wants us to take a stand for what is right, take a stand against slavery and discrimination. Let's read the verse for today together. Ready, go. But love your enemies,
Love your enemies, do good to them, and
get
lend to them
envy,
without
and your
expecting to
reward will
get
be great.
anything back.
Sounds
Then
of
your
love.
reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High. Luke verse 6:35.
The Most High, Luke 6:35.
Awesome. And that's all for today. How was the lesson?
Stop the recording. Recording stop.
Stop the recording? Sure.